Creaky bottom brackets and rubbing disc brakes are two extremely common complaints among cycling enthusiasts and pros alike. Very often we look at the components instead of the frame when we're looking for a solution, and that might well be an error. Bottom brackets, disc brake mounts were designed to be seated in frames that are up to the job, and unfortunately that isn't always the case straight from the factory. And that's where facing comes in. This is the process of removing excess material to ensure that holes that are meant to be round are in fact round and surfaces that are meant to be flat are flat. We're here at Velo Atelier up in Warwick to face this frame and see what a difference that extra step of TLC can make. Co-owner at Velo Atelier, Lee Prescott, has been designing and manufacturing frames for 37 years. He designs and manufactures his own MeteorWorks metal frames, as well as working with partners creating carbon frames such as Fesca and Open, and also servicing frames from a great many brands using lots of different frame materials. Now, he tells me that he never builds a frame up without first checking the tolerances and then facing, reaming and tapping if it needs it. Now, tell me why that is.
We wouldn't even dream of not facing and reaming and tapping all the interfaces on the frame, because it simply makes the build easier and more efficient, and it means that all the parts will last longer and just work more efficiently.
Okay, so you've got a brand new frame that's just come in, or it's a frame that's come in for a really high level service and you've stripped it all off and you're going to check each of the elements of the frame to prep it before building it. Just run me through what exactly you're going to be doing with each area of the frame.
So starting with the disc brake bosses on the frame and the fork, what we're doing there is making sure that they are both parallel to each other and also creating a face that is perpendicular to the disc rotor, so that the pads hit it squarely. Then with the bottom bracket, what we're doing is ensuring, if it's threaded, that all the threads are free and clear and round, so that the threaded bottom bracket will go in nice and easily without damaging any threads. But most importantly, we're making sure that the faces on each side are both parallel to each other and straight and flat, so that any cup that's biting into it is pushing in level and maintaining a level of parallelism. With the headset, we're facing the surface that the bearing is going to mate to. So whether that's an external headset, a zero stack headset, or an internal headset, we're braiding those faces so that they are parallel to each other and ensuring that they're round as well. That way the bearings sit in alignment and prevent any excess wearing of the bearing.
Facing, reaming and tapping are generally associated with metal frames and less so carbon frames, which are made in a mould and in theory should be up to spec and shouldn't really need it. Why might you need to face, ream or tap a carbon frame? And is it something we should perhaps see more of?
So you're right, it's much more prevalent on metal frames, because on a metal frame you have to overcome any warping or distortion that's happened during the welding process. On a carbon frame, as you say, they come out of very expensive moulds that are built to very high tolerances. So most of the time, providing all has gone well with the build, the layup is in the right place, the shrinkage has happened at the appropriate rate, the humidity that were built at, all these factors that need to be controlled and are controlled in good quality factories should mean that the frame comes out in a pretty good state. And then any final fine finishing can be done at the factory just to polish up areas that need a higher tolerance. So it's less required typically on carbon frames, but where the issue arises is when you get certain designs that have separate cups, and then if you're fitting, for instance, at the bottom bracket end, bottom brackets that are two separate cups that aren't joined, and the faces are not parallel, for instance, when you press them in, they can then deform slightly, and that's when you get bearings that are not concentric and parallel. And that's what leads to excess wear and the dreaded squeaking and creaking.
And one way to deal with that might be facing it in terms of the bottom bracket. There are probably more cost-effective options available, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Unless it's wildly out, in which case it's a manufacturing defect and should be under warranty anyway. You can normally get around a lot of these problems by the use of a good quality bottom bracket that's connected in some way. So, something like this that screws together with a very fine thread, that maintains the concentricity and parallelism of the bearings. So that reduces any issues you're going to get with misalignment.
Whereas at the back end with the bosses, that is something that often you might get just that little bit of paint or something. It could be beneficial with a carbon frame. It's not quite so expensive.
No, well, the tooling exists for facing carbon disc brake mounts. So actually facing a carbon frame in that area is no more time consuming or expensive than doing a metal frame. And it's something that most frames could benefit from, even if it's just to remove excess paint that's slightly misaligning the caliper. And it's the key thing is just creating a perpendicular surface to the disc so that when you're clamping that brake caliper to it, it's parallel. So at least your pads are hitting the rotor squarely.
So if you've had a bike that's come into your workshop, it's perhaps not had the best QC, it's not maybe the best frame, and the components haven't been running in it very smoothly, what are the very common symptoms that you would see as a result?
So I guess starting from the rear and moving forwards, obviously disc brake bosses that are not parallel and perpendicular to the disc, you get the rubbing that we all have heard from time to time. It's maybe slightly spongy action on the brake, regardless of how well bled it is. Disc pad wear being very uneven is a real common symptom. And then coming forward to bottom brackets, creaks that can't be defined. When you remove the crank arm, in the worst case scenarios, a misaligned bearing will destroy the crank axle. So things to look for are, when you remove the crank arm, checking the axle to see if there are small scores or uneven wear patterns. Really, your crank arm axle shouldn't be sliding inside the bearing. The bearing should be rotating. If then the bearings are misaligned, then it prevents free rotation, which means you'll start to get more sliding, which as soon as metal slides over metal, you're going to start wearing it away. So, if you've got a very expensive power crank, that's an expensive mistake. And then for headsets, if the bearings in headsets are misaligned, you'll either feel kind of tight spots, so your steering won't be free and even. That can obviously lead on to the actual bearings pitting the races, and then you get kind of indexed steering. And there's no need for it. A nice flat parallel bearing surface means that your headset should last for as long as you want to keep it. I have a Chris King headset that's over 20 years old, and it's swapped from a bike to bike, and it's still running as good now as almost the day I bought it. So
you mentioned to me earlier while we were preparing the last frame that it might be a process that people do if they're going to hold on to a bike for much longer. Is it fair to say that it would take some time to notice that a bike actually was presenting with these problems? Yeah,
potentially. I mean, most brand new bikes with brand new components are going to work and work fairly well and not creak straight off the production line. So for a bottom bracket, for instance, wearing of the bearings due to misalignment is going to take a little time. I would say, if you were really unlucky and you'd got a slightly non-concentric bottom bracket with separate cups that were misaligned when they were pressed in, you'll feel it straight away because the crank won't want to move freely. It might have tight spots in its rotation. And if that's the case, you're going to wear the bearings out really quickly within months. Most problems are not that bad. That's worst case scenario. And if you ever come across that, actually that's a manufacturing issue and a warranty issue. So, you shouldn't be coming to people like us to pay to get it sorted. You should be speaking to the manufacturer and having that problem resolved.
We've talked a lot about, we will talk a lot about tolerance. It will be good just to define that and also to understand, our videographer earlier, I'm sure you might be mentioning, was asking what he was looking for when he was filming the bosses, and the kind of numbers that we're talking about are not viewable to the eye, right?
Not really, no. No, we're talking about fractions of a millimetre. Tolerance essentially refers to the amount above and below the optimum size something can be and it still work properly. Certain areas don't really require a high tolerance, or a very small tolerance, should I say. Other areas do need to be toleranced much more accurately to work correctly. So, such as an interference fit with a hard cup or properly aligned bearings.
And I mean, tolerance is something that the manufacturer would look at as part of their quality control or QC process. But there are actually two sides to that, the other being consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With anything, the higher tolerance you want something, the more laborious that process becomes, and hence the more expensive. Also, checking it, the finer the tolerance, accurately measuring that becomes more difficult and hence costs more as well. With most manufacturing processes, the two things are to what tolerance and also a level of consistency, because you always want as much as possible to have them all the same at the defined tolerance.
So initially actually wrote a feature about this before I came to speak to you, and I spoke to several bike shops in that process. It was probably about 6, and it was almost a 50-50 split between those that said, yes, frames out of tolerance that need facing is a huge problem, we have to do it all the time, and those that said, I don't know what you're talking about, this isn't a problem at all. I mean, the cynic could suggest that it could just be down to their attention to detail. It could also be down to the brands that they're stocking. What other reasons might you give, or are those the only available reasons?
I think both of those reasons are potentially valid. I also think, you know, it's something that these days with mass-produced carbon frames, it's not so prevalent. So there's a lot of shops that may not have the experience to be able to offer that, or may not, you know, want to invest in the appropriate tooling to do metal work in-house. Everything that we've accumulated through the years, if you went to buy it all today, would probably cost you in the region of 6 to 8 grand.
And we've talked an awful lot about tolerances. There's also an element of consistency in there as well, and all of that comes under quality control or QC. Now, explain to me what happens. You've worked as a consultant for brands. What happens in a factory, and why is it that some of them might have more stringent QC than others?
It's all about having a defined level of consistency and having bikes built within a certain tolerance. So the more consistent and the higher or tighter the tolerance that you want, the more you're going to pay, because that requires more checks, more consistent checking. And you know how that is done within each independent factory, again, depends on the price. So, you know, how you want it reported, how you want the testing done, how you want the calibration of the equipment done. The more stringent you want to be, the higher that cost is going to be. So, you know, if you're trying to put out a £1,000 complete carbon road frame, or road bike even, you're not going to be able to physically afford to have the highest levels of quality control. It would make it not a commercially viable option. And it means that all those people that have now got £1,000 road bikes that are exploring the sport and getting into things wouldn't have had that opportunity. So, you know, there's a place for all levels of quality control. You shouldn't always just be right at the very highest, because none of us would afford to buy a bike.
I mean, there must be how much is a reasonable amount of quality control actually adding to the cost of a bike? Is it possible to put a number on that?
It could be anything up to 10 to 15% of the price of a bike is going towards quality control procedures at the higher level. But yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at it as a proportion, which is probably the way you would normally work out how much you can afford to spend on your QC process.
I mean, we can talk about what happens in the factory until the cows come home, but it might not help a rider at home that's got a bike that's creaking or not running smoothly. If someone is watching this video and they think, actually, I think my bike isn't quite right, what should they do?
So I think the key thing really is you just need to go and, if you don't already, find yourself a good, experienced local mechanic and chat to them about the issue and see what they can do for you. There's lots of good, experienced mechanics out there, so you just need to find one that's going to help you out.
So there you have it. Hopefully you're riding along in blissful silence, and if so, good for you. If not, then know that it might well be worth having your frame tolerances checked, and the good news is that fixing the problem might not be as expensive as you think. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then do hit the like button, let us know what you thought in the comments, and subscribe if you'd like to see more of our videos.